folks, and also welcome our presenters, Jessica Brunacini from Maine Sea Grant and Amanda Dwelly from Beach Hill Research. Thank you both. They both have very long days today, which I'm sure many of us have had as well, but I just appreciate them coming on to share their take on these topics and bring their topic expertise into the conversation. And just a couple of housekeeping pieces before we get started. If folks want to, on their Zoom name, if you want to add like your affiliation or your town that you are representative for, or the committee that you are on, also use the chat. Feel free to use the chat to share anything really, like you can share a little bit more about yourself or any resources or questions that come up for you that we can address when we're in our Q&A portion. Use the chat freely that way, and then clarify in your Zoom name, however you want to be affiliated. So so this is technically it's the second of this workshop series that we've done. This is a two-parter. We did a climate action planning workshop at noon today, and this is sort of a part of that. We're going to be diving into social vulnerability assessments, which is often linked to the climate action plan, but certainly doesn't need to only be in a climate action plan. And then a huge piece of any planning effort, but certainly social vulnerability assessments and climate action planning is engagement. And then particularly when we're doing engagement, how we want to do engagement equitably. So we're going to really focus on equitable engagement. So this, as I mentioned, this is the second of this series, which is what we're calling Building Stronger Communities in Practice. We did a bunch of Building Stronger Communities workshops last year up until May of this year, which was really more of like a webinar style online learning series. And for the next few months, we really want to do more of like a workshop style where it's a smaller group and we're doing some presentation, but then allowing a good chunk of time for interaction between communities and like everyone to share resources, help develop ideas, use the collective wisdom and expertise in the room to really kind of help you develop your projects, get some of your challenges addressed, answer questions that you might have, and really learn from each other. So that's our goal with these workshops. So I'm just going to do, I think I know everyone here, but I'm just going to say hi. Gabe McPhail. I'm the manager for the Region 1 Coordinator Collaborative, which is the Community Resilience Partnership regional coordinator for Region 1. And I work with folks at Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission, Lincoln County Regional Planning Commission, Greater Portland Council of Governments. We work as a collaborative along with a bunch of advisory partners. Some are who are on the call today from nonprofits, state agencies. And so together we work to serve the communities that are enrolled in Region 1 of the Community Resilience Partnership, which is Southern Oxford, York, Cumberland, Sagadahoc, Lincoln, and Knox counties. So as I mentioned, we have Jessica Brunacini from Maine Sea Grant here tonight, and we have Amanda Dwelly from Beach Hill Research. And what we're going to do is, after I get done talking, which is very, very soon, Jessica is going to take us into looking at social vulnerability assessments and equitable engagement. We're going to pause if folks have questions around the content that was shared. We won't start diving into the workshop portion yet, but just, in case there's particular things that need to be clarified or asked around what Jessica's presented. And then we're going to talk with Amanda about putting social vulnerability assessment into practice and kind of looking at a project that she's working on and developing with the community that she's working with. And then we'll again offer a little time for questions with Amanda. And then we'll open it up to workshopping your ideas, talking about successes, challenges, things that you want to kind of dive into around social vulnerability assessment and equitable engagement. Then we'll wrap up by 7. but we'll also be able to stay on for 15 minutes after if folks have anything else they want to talk about, things we didn't quite get to during the hour that we have together. So that being said, I'm going to come off of my screen share, and Jessica and I think, Jess, you're doing your screen share, correct? Yep. Okay, great. All right. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica, and we will get started. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, Gabe. Let's see. I'm going to try and do this correctly with the screen share. It is great to be with you all this evening. Thank you so much. Let's see, start from, okay. So can I just get a show of hand or like a thumbs up, Gabe, that you're seeing the slides?
I'm seeing your like your notes presentation.
Okay.
Or sort of your
Yep.
one. There we go. That's perfect.
That?
You're on full
Good?
screen now.
Okay.
Yep, that's great.
So as Gabe said, I'm Jessica Brunicini. I'm a coastal resilience specialist with Maine Sea Grant and also with the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership. And a lot of my work centers around providing technical assistance to municipalities, as well as to regional planning organizations and different types of research projects about how we think about social vulnerability and how we achieve an equitable engagement. So I'm excited to share some of my thinking with you this evening and some of what I've learned from everybody I've been working with. My portion of the presentation is really supposed to give you kind of like a 30,000 foot overview of what we're talking about here. And I think that a lot of you are probably going to be familiar with some of the kind of concepts or frameworks that I'm sharing with you. But this is just meant to make sure that we're all starting from the same place once Amanda takes over and starts to talk about how she's doing this work in practice. So with that, oh, already did the intro. So, so before we actually dig into either one of these topics, I always like to turn it over to you first, because I think hearing from you and hearing your perspectives and your knowledge kind of helps me to tailor my presentations and what I'm talking about. So I wanted to turn it over to you all and ask, where are you at, either kind of personally or with the communities that you're working with, in terms of addressing either one of or both of these kind of topics within the climate resilience work that you are doing. So I would love to hear just like a really brief snippet about, are you addressing these issues? Are you working on them? How is that going? Are you not working on them? Is there a reason that you're not working on them? Are there some barriers? So I'm going to open the floor, and I can't really see everybody. So if you just want to shout out your answers, like, how's it going with these two topics for anybody that's here tonight?
Well, it's Bill Bow from Rockport. It's going great for us because Amanda's doing the work.
Yes, you really lucked out with that. Yes, and Amanda will be telling us a lot more about how she's putting this work into practice later on. So everybody else will get a good sense of how lucky you are.
All right. Well, we get a free pass tonight.
Anybody else?
Hey, Jessica, it's Rachel Hamilton. And I just want to say that I haven't had any big experiences in practice yet. So that's, maybe on the start of my journey, a few introductory experiences.
Yeah, that's great. And that's actually really important for me, I think, to know is, if this is something that maybe people have been thinking about or kind of reading about, or like from a theoretical perspective understand, but haven't necessarily been able to kind of put it into practice. I think that's what we're hoping to do tonight. I'll leave that open for maybe one more comment if somebody wants to share.
Hi, Jessica. This is Melanie.
Hi, Melanie.
Hi. One way that I don't know if this is like quite to practice, but almost there, with social vulnerability is with any communities that I've worked with in the past or that I'm working with now, as they apply for the Community Resilience Partnership and the Community Action Grants. They're having to take a really close look at where do we fall on that scale and why, which then helps inform or at least should, and we're pushing towards that, inform what grant money they're going after and what their reasoning is. So that's one example I've been part of.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. So in the interest of time, we'll move ahead. And we'll certainly come back to this. We'll circle back to this, but for the interest of time, let's dig into what we're talking about here this evening. So before we kind of dig into social vulnerability specifically and what it is and why it matters, it's important to kind of take a step back and talk about, what are we talking about here? Why did we get here? Why are we talking about this? So ultimately, a lot of the work that we're doing as people who are focused on coastal resilience or climate adaptation work really comes down to addressing climate risks and reducing them for, the communities or the ecosystems that we are working with or on behalf. So it's reducing risk. And risk is composed of, a variety of different dimensions, including hazards, exposure, responses, and vulnerabilities. So just to break it down into simple terms, when we're talking about hazards, when we're talking about climate hazards, we're talking about things like the impacts of climate change, flooding, drought, wildfires, heat waves, etc. When we're talking about exposure, that is dictated by things like geography, right? Where are people living in relation to the hazard? It's also dictated by things like land use planning, right? Where are people living within these communities? How are they living? And then we get to the vulnerabilities. And that is basically about how likely an individual or a community is to be impacted by that climate risk, whatever it might be. It can also be informed by how exposed people are. So vulnerability is impacted by many different things, including obviously people's physical exposure to risk. So in Maine, we along our coast, we have a lot of people who are physically exposed to risk because they live right next to the ocean or right next to a marsh that is tidally influenced. And as sea level is rising, those people are becoming more exposed to risk. But another dimension of vulnerability is the type of capacity or resources that people have to prepare for or to respond to those risks. So when it comes to vulnerability, there's kind of a spectrum, like there are many, many different types of topics when we're talking about climate change, but we can think about it as, at least in some ways, as physical vulnerability and social vulnerability. And the latter, the social vulnerability, is obviously what we're here to talk about today. So social vulnerability can be described or defined as certain conditions or circumstances that affect an individual or community's capacity to anticipate, confront, repair, recover. I would also add respond, mitigate, etc. From the effects of a stressor or a shock, including climate change impacts or disasters. And this is a definition that comes from Eileen Johnson from Bowdoin College, who has definitely been at the forefront of a lot of this work in Maine, and we have all learned a lot from her. Before I go on to kind of giving you a sense of what some of the, characteristics or those circumstances are, I wanted to ask you, because I know that you are all very knowledgeable, what do you think some of those conditions or circumstances or characteristics are that might make individuals, communities more socially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change? And again, just feel free to come off mute and shout your answer out.
Jess, it's Gabe. So I live on Vinyl Haven, which relies heavily on the lobster fishery, or primarily on the lobster fishery. So thinking about warming waters and the vulnerability of the industry. So that's definitely a factor, just that people's livelihoods depend entirely on that one industry. And if that changes and people lose their income, there really aren't a lot of other options. So they are really vulnerable to that economic change caused by climate change.
Yeah. Thank you, Gabe. Anybody else want to share an idea that they might have about the conditions or circumstances that would lead people to be more vulnerable from a social perspective?
Well, I just think about, power outages from, these storm events that are going on, particularly in the winter. if we have these rather extended outages and the individuals don't have the ability for alternative, power to keep their house warm, they're going to, have frozen pipes and breaks and all that sort of thing. And, I'm fortunate enough to have hired an electrician and bought a generator so that I don't have that problem. But others don't have that capacity to be able to, recover from those sorts of events.
Yes, that's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, so some of the things that, that we're hearing here is that, it might be the type of livelihood that people are dependent on, or the type of, industry that people work in, or the types of, potentially financial resources that people have to be able to prepare or respond to these types of climate impacts. So here are the different indicators that are part of the Maine Social Vulnerability Index. And again, Eileen Johnson with a team of people, including Liz Hertz and Jeremy Bell, have developed and are continuing actually to develop the Maine Social Vulnerability Index. And so these are some of the indicators, or those characteristics or conditions that in Maine are likely to make people or communities more socially vulnerable than others. So you can see that there are these four kind of main buckets or primary buckets: socioeconomic status, household composition and disability, minority status and language, and housing and transportation. So each one of these buckets has a different type of indicator that we can look at to kind of better understand social vulnerability in the context of Maine. And there are 17 of these indicators. Now, this isn't the only way to think about, what are those different characteristics or conditions that might make people socially vulnerable. The Maine Climate Council has also started to work on this, and they have identified the following populations as what they are referring to as priority populations. So again, these are the types of characteristics or conditions that the Maine Climate Council is suggesting that communities take into account when they're thinking about, who in these places are the folks who are most vulnerable and who have potentially the least or lesser resources to respond. I wanted to make a note about the language that they're using here, which is priority populations. You'll notice that that's different than socially vulnerable populations or disadvantaged populations or underrepresented populations. I think it's really interesting. And Amanda, I think you may have been involved in developing this list. So again, we're lucky to have you here tonight. But I have been really interested in the way that they're framing the language that they're using here. Not everybody wants to be referred to as socially vulnerable. Not everybody wants to be referred to as disadvantaged. So language really does matter. It's also important to recognize that people are not born inherently socially vulnerable. It's typically the systems in which they live that make them vulnerable, right? That marginalize them in certain ways, or don't provide them with the types of resources that they need to meet their basic needs. So just kind of a point to talk about, if you're doing this type of work in your community, you don't have to use kind of like preconceived language. You can pick a term or a phrasing that works for you and that respects the people that you're trying to kind of learn about and support in this work. So as you can see here, and from the previous slide, there are a lot of different indicators or characteristics that we can look to better understand who is socially vulnerable. But what are the types of tools or data or information that we can actually use to better understand who those people might be in our communities and where they might live, especially in relation to climate impacts and risks? So there are a few different screening tools that I am sure most of you are familiar with, but again, just so we're all on the same page, one of them is the Coastal Risk Explorer, which is part of a tool that was produced by the Nature Conservancy here in Maine. And this is taking that Maine Social Vulnerability Index and overlaying it with census data and geospatial information to kind of show us in a visual way where those vulnerable communities are in Maine, right? So this is a tool that is available for everyone to use. I know that Eileen and team are going through a process of updating this so that it reflects the newest available data, but it is something that is freely and readily available to everybody. Another tool that is recently developed by the White House Council on Environmental Quality is the Climate Justice and Economic Screening Tool, or CJEST. And this is a tool that, again, uses census data. It looks at census tracts, and it's comparing that with information about climate change impacts, energy, health, housing, and it's coupling that primarily with people's income. So one of the ways that the CJEST tool is identifying socially vulnerable populations is whether or not they're low income. And then the final tool that I'll highlight here, but this is certainly not the last. There are many, many, many different screening tools, but this is the EPA's Environmental Justice Screening Tool. And again, we have census data here overlaid with different indicators, primarily demographic data, showing us who in this region is likely to be impacted or likely to be an environmental justice community. So these are some of the screening tools that exist for us to get a better sense, or at least to start to understand where socially vulnerable populations might be living. And ultimately, they are a great place to start, but they depend on quantitative census data, which often tells an incomplete or sometimes an even incorrect story. And I think that Amanda will actually talk about some of the limitations of using quantitative and especially census data in her portion of the workshop. But also it's important to note that not all social vulnerabilities, like those characteristics that we were looking at, they can't all be displayed geospatially. So sometimes these mapping tools are really helpful, but sometimes they don't actually help us drill down into those characteristics. So in a place like Maine, where we have a lot of smaller rural communities, where sometimes a whole census tract is like an actual entire community, so we can't get into the data at a more localized scale, these screening tools are a good way to start. But ultimately, we also have to incorporate more qualitative approaches to understanding social vulnerability. And so that's where this component of equitable engagement starts to come in. And one project that I want to highlight, and I know there's a few people on the call who are representative from this team, is the Southern Midcoast Social Resilience Project, which is, I should say, an ongoing collaboration between the different organizations that you see here. And one of the goals of the Social Resilience Project was to better understand how communities are thinking about social vulnerability and how it is applied during kind of emergency response events. And one of the things that the Social Resilience Project has really highlighted is the need to do that qualitative engagement with people to better understand about social vulnerabilities on the ground. So through a long and kind of iterative process of really deep engagement with different sectors, the project went above and beyond those 17 indicators that were identified in the Maine Social Vulnerability Index, and through that engagement with project participants, identified a whole other slew of vulnerabilities that are important for thinking about social vulnerability in the Southern Midcoast region. So the point that I want to make here is that the Social Resilience Project really did a great job and continues to do a great job of going to the people who are either part of socially vulnerable populations or who are working with or representing them. And that means thinking more broadly than kind of the organizations or the people who we normally think of when we think of working on coastal resilience. So that would include things like social service providers, which is one of the key sectors that this project has engaged with, as well as working with emergency management agencies and associates. And the types of engagement that the project uses and has used in the past and will continue to use in the future is surveys, interviews, focus groups, and also a scenario-based exercise where we actually get to go through kind of what it looks like for there to be an extreme climate event and who might be vulnerable and how do we respond. So this is just kind of point out that, you know, we saw those lists from the quantitative data that we can find information on. Once we start to do the qualitative engagement with people, we start to get a much more robust and holistic picture of what social vulnerability is. And on that note, I'm going to kind of make the linkage to engagement and equitable engagement and what we mean by that. So if we want to learn more about social vulnerability, again, we can't expect people to come to us to share that information. We have to go to them, and we have to think creatively about how do we actually engage with these groups and with these knowledge holders. And I have shared this spectrum of community engagement to ownership with a number of people recently, and they have found it really helpful in terms of thinking about, what are the ways that we actually can engage with and learn from these communities. So particularly when we're thinking about climate action planning or coastal resilience planning, we want to be moving somewhere further to the right hand of the spectrum if our goal is indeed equity, to have equitable outcomes. So the reason that I like this framework is that it helps to provide an idea of the types of activities that people can take on if they're trying to move from one end of the spectrum to the other. So you can see in that activities column that doing things like community-driven planning, participatory budgeting, participatory action research is much more on the kind of community ownership end of moving towards equity. Whereas things like providing fact sheets or open houses is actually a great example, because you are creating a space, which is great, but you are hoping that people are coming to you when in fact we really need to be going towards people and organizations that are representing socially vulnerable communities. So in the interest of time, I know we don't have a ton of time tonight, just kind of getting back to that question of how are these things related? And what I want to leave you with is basically the best way to learn about social vulnerability is through equitable engagement, right? We learn about social vulnerability through equitable engagement. If we want to know more at the local level, we have to go beyond those geospatial and that quantitative data and really incorporate that kind of qualitative and relational engagement with people. But on the flip side, once we know more about social vulnerability in our communities and who those socially vulnerable populations are, that helps us also to achieve equitable engagement. So we are fostering equitable engagement through a better understanding of social vulnerability, because once we have a sense of who in our community is socially vulnerable, what their needs are, how we can go to them and meet them where they are, then we can develop better engagement plans. And so I think there is where I am going to leave it for Amanda to take over. Whoops. And share more about how she's doing this in practice. But before that, I would love to take any of your questions or comments or concerns that you might have at this point.
This is Rachel. Oh, you're not sharing your screen anymore, so you know it's me. I wanted to just acknowledge or second to last slide, the facilitating power diagram. That's really cool, and I'm going to look into more. I know it's a 2019 paper, but it was like a better, a more in-depth developed example of Sherry Arnstein's ladder for citizen participation. So I thought that was really great, and I love the ladder, but this is like even more in-depth tool, which is really great.
Yes, and thank you for saying that. And it's funny that you say that, because actually Kristen and I earlier today were talking about kind of the evolution of these different spectrums of public participation or ladder, and we were both saying, like, Sherry Arnstein, 1969, told us kind of the things that we need to know about what it means to engage with people. And then there's, the International Association of Public Participation, which kind of built on her work. But the reason that I like this graphic from Facilitating Power is because it kind of helps to provide more context or more details about what that actually looks like. And I can share the link for that report in the chat. And I think if there are no other comments or questions at this point, it makes sense to turn it over to Amanda.
Hi, I am still working out how I'm going to share
Do you want me to screen share it for
slides.
you, Amanda?
I did make some updates as Jessica was talking, so I'm not quite sure how to do that unless you want to screen
Yeah,
share the Google Slides.
I have the most recent version, so I can share.
That would be wonderful.
Okay.
So I'm glad Bill and Megan could make it. I live in Rockport, and I'm a social science researcher by training, so have that perspective of research. But this is admittedly the first time I'm doing a project like this, so really excited about the opportunity to share where we are at the very beginning stage in fully workshop mode, and did want to share some early thinking really to get some ideas and learn from those of you who've done this in other places. So I'm kind of putting this forward as here's some of our thinking, but also a lot of questions and uncertainties about how to reach people and how to learn the things we want to learn. I will get into that. So let's look at the first slide. And this is basically the 5 components that Bill, Megan, and the Rockport Conservation Commission laid out in our climate action grant application. And the goal is really to gather baseline data to inform and prioritize strategies. So this is really the first step of gathering all the inputs that would go into other planning efforts. So there will be an ecosystem assessment, an infrastructure assessment, and greenhouse gas emissions inventory, as well as a social vulnerability assessment and community outreach. So we have all the pieces there, and really have the grant approved in progress. As I start the social vulnerability assessment, I kind of came to it with questions on how these pieces might come together to really understand what information we need to gather from people, and then also toward equitable engagement, switching from that research mindset of, oh, I want information from people, to we're operating in a town with a lot of strong existing networks and organizations. So it's not just about getting information from people, but how do we use this whole process of gaining information and doing outreach to build the relationships that will ultimately strengthen and support the people we most want to serve. So how do we make this really two-way and build on some of the relationships? So let's go to the next slide. So these are some of kind of the questions I've been thinking about just to understand where the social vulnerability assessment fits in, so that it's useful and fits with the pieces of the whole. So it's not an independent chapter of the report, with the idea that, this information, we want to bring forward information about priority populations to mix with everything else. So really trying to understand what are the goals of the project overall? What are we trying to achieve? What might be done with this information? Who are we trying to influence? Are we trying to influence town staff or select board or voters to potential ballot measures? Or are we trying to influence individuals? Are we driving to a set of individual climate actions, like removing invasive species or home improvements or collective actions? What are the climate impacts and strategies that the town wants to cover, to make sure that as we go out and talk to people and learn from what's out there, we're kind of speaking to their vulnerabilities and capacity in those same areas. And then I really got to this question, which we were able to talk through with the Conservation Commission a couple of weeks ago. Really, and this really gets at the facilitating power spectrum of really what is the role of public outreach, public engagement, community involvement in this process. And we'll speak a little about that. So let's go forward there. So this is kind of, we didn't use the facilitating power diagram per se, but these are kind of components of it. As I started hearing different ideas on how people thought public outreach would be included in the climate action grant, as well as getting information. In terms of the social vulnerability assessment, one role of engagement or input could be gaining input on experiences. So hearing about people's experiences with climate change, extreme weather, hearing about their concerns and priorities. I'm sure many of you have seen surveys about this or participated in workshops like this. Also, is there any need as we intersect with the infrastructure assessment and the ecosystem assessment to fill in data gaps? Are there things we don't know about local conditions for stormwater or housing conditions? Or are there things we don't know about transportation access or health that we need to do outreach to get that information? Option B here, to what extent does the town or the planners, in this case, want to involve the public in co-developing strategies? Would they want to perhaps host a workshop or get input when maps or different assessment outputs are available to inform what the strategies are? A little further down the line could be prioritizing strategies once developed. And option C is, maybe I've, flipped the spectrum around a little bit, but option C, outreach, could also be interpreted or defined as wanting people to see or receive education and communications. And some people, as we had this conversation, talked about wanting to use outreach to kind of raise awareness of threats, local conditions, invasive species. Also could be used to provide information for people to adapt or respond individually. And then as we started getting into the questions people had that they were hoping the social vulnerability assessment might cover, is what is preventing people from taking individual actions? And a lot of questions about information, what channels and groups are people already using, and how can we reach vulnerable populations? A lot of recognition that, we've had community events, town meetings, things like that, a recognition that the people who show up for town meetings probably aren't representative of everyone in the town and probably don't represent the priority population. So how can we kind of get input earlier in the process so that later engagement efforts are more effective? And all right. And so that kind of, okay, so great. So let's move on to the next slide. And these are kind of how I'm thinking of the 5 different components of the assessment. We might take a kind of staggered approach to these. So as Jessica mentioned, there's a ton of data out there at the town level, and sometimes a smaller level, which I'll get to in a minute, from which we could kind of construct a population summary, demographics, income, housing, health, public health. And there, I really want to focus on existing indices and automated reports versus using our own raw data or analysis of census data, because there is a lot of, there's a high margin of error in it because of the way it's collected. So at the level of Rockport, which is just one census tract, as you start breaking it down further, it doesn't really give you a lot, and it might have a high margin of error. So I'm doing this, we'll get some information, but the actual numbers are a little bit fuzzy. They have big error bounds around them. The other piece of data that we have would be working with town assessor parcel data, where you could extract certain features, possibly in water, waste, home value, home condition, tenure in the home, non-resident status. We haven't requested that yet, but considering that to get more granular and perhaps paint more of a neighborhood picture when some of the, for a small town like Rockport, again, the census tracked data won't paint that whole picture. Oh, and one other thing on kind of the population summary, there's also state data on public health and environmental public health that can kind of augment the census data. I put at the center of this really following and learning a lot from the Wells Reserve Project, service provider and local organization input. Because we don't know yet, as you see, kind of put resident input on the right. We already did have a public meeting to get preliminary concerns, but as I mentioned earlier, we don't really know how to reach priority populations yet, and know that we probably need to do that through existing relationships and networks. So rather than go straight to a survey, want to go through these other avenues and learn a lot more about people through people they are already might be working with. So first, talking to service providers can help us gain insight for people that we can't access. But second, as a researcher, I'm starting to become very aware of this kind of burden of surveys and providing input on things, and all of the other efforts going on where people might need to provide input. So I am thinking, how can we both be most respectful of all of these people's times, both service providers and residents and town staff, to kind of ask them questions at the right point of the experience. And I'll get into some questions I have about what is the right way to engage from the start with service providers. Besides getting information, how can we make the best use of that, of their time? All right, so let's move on for a second. And just a little bit more, I'll leave you with this, some thoughts on census data. A lot of what we think of as census data is actually from small annual samples. We stopped really doing the only thing we kind of do as a census is count people, but a lot of the questions that we're interested about, income, age distribution, health insurance, housing, it's based on these small samples, which really just aren't that strong at the level of a small town or census tract. And then surveys, I've certainly fielded a lot of surveys, but have definitely seen the limitations, especially among the priority populations we're talking about. A survey on its own without partners to help you distribute it probably won't reach the people you're most interested in hearing from. It can also be perceived, in some situations I've seen it be perceived as impersonal or a little bit hands-off. If people think that, if it's coming from the town, why doesn't someone come talk to me about it? Or, I have an open door, I'm a business owner, come talk to me about it. People also might feel like, I've answered these questions before. I don't really want to take another survey about climate concerns. And then I'm not a person who likes surveys. So again, thinking there, how can we mine previous input, get information that has come up in public meetings, mine social media posts, look everywhere. This is kind of where I am of reducing burden on people to take surveys. Have people already given input to a comprehensive plan or hazard mitigation plan? And then think of those surveys as a way to kind of fill gaps later after other things. And then also we're thinking about how to combine anything we would want in a survey with other surveys going on. For example, the Knox Emergency Management Agency's Hazard Mitigation Plan might do a survey. And I don't know if that's possible, but just trying to find ways to do that. So let's go on, and this is where I would kind of love input as we workshop. So thank you, Jessica and Kristen and others who worked in Wells for kind of putting forth everything in writing that you did. So starting to come up with a list of service providers in our area. None of these are really town specific. These are all organizations that work across the county or a broad region. So coming to them about just our town is kind of interesting. But some of the questions on the right, you know, we might want input about social vulnerability, resources, assets for climate change. What is the right approach to reach out for input and to kind of strengthen relationships for future outreach and services? And another way to put it is kind of, what do we have to offer? What would their benefit be to speak with us? I mean, even if we do give an incentive or compensation, it's still taking up some of their time. So why would they want to do that? Another thought is, who is the right person to reach out? And these are kind of split on this, but and also who should be in the room to hear feedback. You know, what relationships do the town or people involved in the climate action plan already have with these organizations to reach out? How can we put outreach in the hands of existing relationships and people who might want to be relationship holders going forward? So I could very well do one-time outreach and convince someone to talk to me, but am I going to be the one to maintain a relationship going forward? And how can you spend that time and investment in relationships that are going to be stickier? And then also this question of who should be in the room to hear feedback. Should that be kind of a research perspective, or is there someone else who, if they hear that information firsthand, it might be more powerful for them or meaningful to them? Should it be one-on-ones, just to be able to go to someone's office and have them schedule whenever they want? Or would they maybe want to meet with multiple organizations together? And then again, you know, just making sure we can offer some kind of compensation. So getting close to the end of my section, but would just love feedback on these as we circle around. We can go to the next slide for now. And kind of building on what Jessica presented earlier about priority populations, what are some of the things we might ask about? And I think in this case, you know, there have been surveys about concerns about climate change, but how do we really get information that informs, going back to Eileen Johnson's quote, our understanding of their capacity to adapt, respond both individually and collectively. So questions I might ask of any data we have, or service providers, or citizens as we get there. Again, information access and networks. How are they getting information, but also what are their social and organizational networks? What are impacts they are experiencing or might experience around transportation and medical access, health sensitivity to extreme heat or cold, also water quality, and then increasingly mental health. And the Conservation Commission talked a lot about climate anxiety and trying to understand that. Housing vulnerability, thinking that some of the adaptation actions might be individual, or we, you know, might need to could help people prepare their homes, and there's certainly a lot of resources out there for that. Financial resources, people's physical capacity, I mean, storm recovery, being able to deal with basement flooding, extreme snow, fallen trees. Not mentioned here, I would consider kind of economic resources and capacity a little bit different to Gabe's point about, you know, a community being tied to a natural resource industry. Let's see what is next. that might be it. Right, so I think we had just a couple closing slides and resources. So Gabe and Jessica, I'm not sure. Yeah. So here are just a few data sources of many for what I would call kind of prepackaged analysis or information that's already kind of pulled together at the town level. I love this neighborhoods at risk tool that Headwaters Economics developed that pulls together a lot of the census data and shows your town versus the state versus the country to get a relative sense. The state public health tracking indicators has environmental, public health, and some other health indicators. And Jessica mentioned these other three already. A little bit of extra reading, not just on social vulnerability, but on how all the pieces can come together, which we didn't really get into today.
Yeah, and I think on that point, Amanda, like we want to recognize that there are some things that we didn't have time to cover, and we've talked with Gabe, and she has acknowledged that we could do a whole workshop on equitable engagement alone and what that actually means and what that looks like. So we did just want to acknowledge that, Amanda, I think you did. I mean, Amanda kind of talked about how she is working to do a social vulnerability assessment as part of kind of a broader social vulnerability assessment or climate vulnerability assessment or analysis, but we didn't really talk about how to stitch those together. We also didn't really talk about kind of specific outreach or engagement strategies for how to build those relationships with socially vulnerable individuals, communities, or the people who serve them. I think Amanda asked some really important questions. We also did not talk about what happens when you know more about social vulnerability and what happens when you've effectively done equitable engagement. What does that mean for actually identifying and implementing resilience strategies? And I think the point that I want to drive home with that is that there are lots of things that we can do that decreases risk from, especially of physical exposure dimension, right? Like we can raise our roads, we can improve our culverts, we might even be able to move people, away from out of harm's way, potentially away from the coast or other flooded areas. Those strategies don't ultimately address the underlying drivers of social vulnerability, right? Because again, people aren't inherently socially vulnerable. That's a systemic issue. And so we just want to acknowledge that is a much kind of bigger, deeper question that I think a lot of us are grappling with. Like, what does a resilience plan look like when it does actually address those underlying drivers of social vulnerability? But we would also love to hear, like, what else were you hoping to get from this, or what else did we miss? What are the challenges that you are facing? Or what, also, what are the successes that you're having in your community?